The most unforgettable meal of Johann Müller's life came from the enemy. That alone should tell you this story isn't going where you think it is. It was November 1944. The war was still tearing the world apart. Back then, nobody was expecting mercy. Cities were burned down to their bones. Families were scattered. Every night, radios whispered long lists of names that never came home. And I've always thought the word over is dangerous in war. People say it like a door slamming shut, but for the ones inside it, nothing ever ends that clean. No one told Johann where they were taking him when the trucks arrived that morning in September. Everything was collapsing by then. Ammunition gone, food gone, orders half-spoken and never finished. When American soldiers surrounded his unit near the Rhine, something unbelievable happened. Nobody fired. Nobody even lifted a weapon. They just stood there, looking at each other, exhausted, hollow. Johann was sure this was it. He expected death. What he got instead was water, a cigarette, and a young American private who kept saying, "You're safe now, it's over." It didn't feel over. And honestly, that's the part most history books don't slow down for the moment when the fighting stops, but nothing inside you knows what that means yet. The trip across the ocean was long and silent. Hundreds of German soldiers crammed below deck. The air was thick with salt, sweat, and unwashed clothes. Some men cried at night. Some stared at the ceiling like they'd already left their bodies behind. Johann thought about his mother, her tiny kitchen in Cologne, the radio humming in the evenings, the way she always set an extra plate at dinner just in case his father might still walk through the door from the Eastern Front. He didn't know yet that he would never see that kitchen again. The camp sat outside a small farming town. Wooden barracks, watchtowers, flat fields of corn turning brown in the autumn wind. The Americans called it Camp Willow Creek. To Johann, it looked like the loneliest place on earth. Have you ever been somewhere that didn't just look empty, but made you feel like the world had quietly stepped away from you? Life there became a pattern: roll call, work details, thin soup, hard bread, letters that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. He met Erich Bauer on the second day, tall, sharp-nosed, always moving his hands when he talked, always wearing the same crooked half-smile. "This war is finished," Erich said one night, staring at the ceiling. "It just hasn't figured it out yet." They both laughed, quietly, because what else could you do? Then, late in November, something shifted. It started with a smell. Johann was stacking crates in the storage shed when it hit him. Warm, rich, buttery, nothing like the gray soup they'd been surviving on. His hands stopped moving. Around him, other prisoners froze too, heads lifted, noses in the air. "Do you smell that?" Erich whispered. The smell followed them everywhere, back to the barracks, to roll call across the yard. Even the guards looked different, quieter, distracted, almost lighter. That evening, a rumor moved through the camp like a spark jumping dry grass. The Americans were preparing a holiday, a meal for them. Nobody believed it. "Why would they feed us like guests?" Erich scoffed. "We're the enemy." But the smell kept coming, day after day. Roasted meat, fresh bread, sweet spices. Johann hadn't smelled cinnamon since before Cologne burned. 2 nights later, Captain William Harris stood before the prisoners during evening formation. Calm, tired eyes, a voice that didn't waste time. "Men," he said, "this Thursday is Thanksgiving. Folks from town are coming to help us mark the day. You'll be joining us." The yard went dead quiet. Someone laughed. Someone else whispered a prayer. Johann felt his chest tight. "Join them." He glanced at Erich, whose mouth was still hanging open. "There will be a proper meal," Harris continued. "You'll be treated as guests." No one moved. The idea didn't even feel real. That night, Johann lay awake listening to the wind scrape the walls of the barracks. His stomach growled. His thoughts wouldn't slow down. Thanksgiving meant nothing to him. But a feast meant something: family, safety, a table where nobody was afraid. He didn't trust it. Thursday morning, the guards unlocked the barracks early. In the yard, long tables waited. White cloths fluttered in the cold breeze. Real plates, real cups, trucks rolled in from town, women, children, old men. One dark-haired woman stepped down holding a basket of bread. She smiled at the prisoners, unsure, like she didn't know what kind of moment she was walking into. Her name was Sarah Whitman. The prisoners lined up, hesitant, hungry, watching. When Johann finally sat, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then the turkey arrived. Real turkey. Steam curled into the air. Someone across the table whispered, "My God." Johann lifted his fork. He hadn't used one in months. For the first time since the war began, nobody was shouting. Nobody was running. Nobody was dying. And Johann Müller knew with a sudden ache behind his eyes that this was the moment he would carry for the rest of his life. History books don't talk about days like this. They rush past them. But this is where everything starts changing. And here's where it gets strained. The most important part of that day hadn't even happened yet. A few minutes ago, Johann Müller was just prisoner number 317, staring at a turkey like it was a mirage. Now he was sitting at a table with the enemy and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He tried to look normal, really tried, straightened his shoulders, kept his eyes down, told himself this was just food, just a meal, nothing more, but his body didn't buy it. The fork felt heavy. The plate looked too clean. The steam from the turkey carried a smell so warm it almost hurt. Butter, pepper. Something sweet folded into the air. He swallowed and his throat tightened like his own hunger was something he should apologize for. Around him, men who had lived through artillery and street fighting suddenly didn't know what to do with kindness. Some stared at their plates, waiting for the trick. Some ate too fast, like it might vanish if they slowed down. One older man, gray at the temples, broke down before he even touched the food and hid his face in his hands. Eric leaned in. "If this is a joke," he whispered, "it's the cruelest one I've ever seen." Johann didn't answer. An American guard, Freckles, barely old enough to shave, walked between the tables carrying a pitcher of something dark. He poured it into cups like this was the most normal thing in the world. Coffee. Real coffee. Johann's mind jumped back to his mother's kitchen. The radio humming in the background, the smell of coffee when they still had it. The way small comforts once felt permanent. You never think a cup of coffee will make you cry until it does. Across from him, a woman from town stepped forward, Sarah Whitman. Her hands were red from the cold. Her coat was mended at the elbows. She set down a basket of bread and offered it with a cautious smile. "For you," she said slowly, like she wasn't sure the words would land. Johann hesitated, then reached out. His fingers brushed the cloth lining. The bread was warm, fresh. He looked up. Their eyes met for half a second. She didn't look at him like a monster. That was the moment the air left his lungs. A few children stood near the edge of the yard with their parents. One boy stared openly at the prisoners, trying to match the stories he'd heard with the faces he was seeing now. Johann wondered what those stories sounded like in this town. What words people used for Germans when the radio crackled at night and newspapers hit the doorsteps. Monsters, Huns, devils. And yet here they were, those same people, carrying pies and bowls of potatoes into a camp full of men they'd been taught to hate. Captain Harris moved between the tables, not like a guard watching prisoners, but like someone making sure the room stayed calm. When he stopped behind Johann stiffened. Old reflex. "Eat," the captain said quietly. "No one's taking it away." Johann nodded, cut a piece of turkey, brought it to his mouth. The first bite nearly broke him. It tasted like real life, like the world hadn't fully collapsed. Like somewhere people still sat at tables and talked about ordinary things. He chewed slowly. His eyes burned. Eric ate too, but his movements were tight, careful. "I don't get this," he muttered. "They should hate us." "Maybe they do," Johann said. "Maybe this is what they do anyway." Eric stared at him like he was seeing him for the first time. Then he took another bite, slower. A thin American man stepped into the yard carrying a violin case. He looked unsure, like he was checking whether music was allowed in a place like this. He opened the case, lifted the violin, and began to play. The camp went quiet, not from fear, from listening. Johann didn't recognize the tune, but it carried something soft that pushed the cold farther away. Men looked up. Plates froze mid-air. Even the guards stopped walking. Then one German prisoner began to hum. Another joined. Then another, not because they knew the song, because they needed something to hold on to. Johann remembered the last music he'd heard back home, a piano playing through shattered windows in a building that didn't even have a roof anymore. He had thought beauty was useless in a world like that. Now he wasn't so sure. Across the yard, the young guard, Thomas Reed, stood watching. No anger, no smile. Just the kind of tired you get when the war has already taken something you can't name. Johann caught his eye. Thomas didn't look away. Johann suddenly wondered who the guard had lost, because everyone had lost someone. The meal continued and the camp slowly changed shape. Voices rose. A laugh slipped out of someone who seemed surprised to hear it. A man joked about American potatoes being too soft, and even a couple guards chuckled. Sarah moved between the tables, refilling cups, placing slices of pie. When she set one in front of Johann, he stared at it like treasure. "What is it?" he asked. "Pumpkin pie," she said. "It's kind of the whole point of today." Johann nodded like he understood. He didn't, but he took a bite, sweet, spiced, warm. For a second, his eyes closed without asking him. In that second, he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a prisoner. He was just a hungry young man at a table being offered something he didn't believe he deserved. Captain Harris cleared his throat. Conversations faded. He didn't give a radio speech, just one sentence. "Today," he said, "we eat because we're alive, and because being alive means we can still choose what kind of people we're going to be." Johann felt Eric shift beside him. The hard edge on his face flickered. Johann looked down at his plate, the crumbs, the smear of pumpkin filling, and something heavier than hunger settled in his chest. If these people could treat him like a human, what did that mean about everything he'd been told? And what did it mean about what he'd done? Once you've been shown mercy, you can't unsee it. That night, when the camp finally went quiet and the wind whispered through the wire, Johann understood something simple and dangerous. The meal was over, but whatever it started was just getting started. Somehow that Thanksgiving table followed Johann long after the plates were cleared. He carried it with him through the cold nights that came next, even before he understood why. The next morning, the camp didn't look different. The wire was still there. The towers were still watching, but the men moved like the ground under them had shifted an inch overnight. Slower, quieter, not free, never that, but careful, as if the world had tilted and nobody wanted to slip. Johann noticed it when he stepped outside the barracks and saw Eric sitting on the wooden stairs, staring at the dirt between his boots. "You look like you didn't sleep," Johann said. Eric shook his head. "I kept waiting for yesterday to disappear, like a dream." Johann sat beside him. Frost clung to the ground. Smoke from the town's chimneys drifted across the yard. He thought about the way Sarah had said pumpkin pie, the way Captain Harris had spoken about choosing what kind of people they were going to be. Funny how a few words can follow you around longer than a whole army. Work details started again. Prisoners were sent into town to unload grain, fix fences, stack lumber. For the first time, the guards let them move without tight formations. Still watched, still not free, but closer to human. That afternoon, Johann was assigned to a barn with 3 other prisoners and an American guard named Thomas Reed, the freckled young man he'd noticed during the meal. The barn smelled of hay and old wood. Dust drifted through the sunlight pouring in through the open doors. They worked in silence for a while, lifting bales, stacking them high against the wall. Johann's arms burned, but it felt good. Useful, almost like farm work back home when he was a boy. Finally, Thomas spoke. His German wasn't perfect, but he tried. "You from Cologne?" Johann froze, then nodded. "Yes." Thomas shifted his weight. "My grandmother, she's from there, or near there, before the war." The words landed between them, heavy with everything they didn't say. "My brother was killed in France," Thomas added. Johann's hands tightened around the hay bale. He didn't know what to do with that sentence. He thought about faces he tried not to remember. "I'm sorry," Johann said. It felt small, but it was all he had. Thomas nodded once. They went back to work. Later that week, letters arrived. Johann's came from his mother. The envelope was thin, the handwriting shaky. He read it twice before the words settled. Their apartment was gone. His father was missing. The neighbors were scattered, but she was alive. He sat on his bunk with the letter pressed to his chest while the room slowly turned around him. Eric sat across the aisle, staring at his own empty hands. "No letter?" Johann asked. Eric shook his head. "None since June." They didn't speak after that. Winter crept closer. The camp settled into colder routines, but something had changed for the Americans too. The guards spoke more softly. Captain Harris made sure extra blankets were passed out. Sarah Whitman began visiting the camp on Sundays, bringing books and helping men write letters. One afternoon, Johann watched her sit with a prisoner who hadn't spoken in weeks, guiding his trembling hand across the page. Now here's where it gets strange. No one ever tells you how hard it is to step back into normal life when your idea of normal has been fear for so long. One gray morning, new prisoners arrived. Thinner, harder. Their eyes carried things Johann didn't want to know. Among them was a boy no older than 17 who shook through roll call. That night the camp felt like the war again. Johann lay awake listening to the wind and wondered which version of the world would survive inside him. And he didn't yet know that before winter ended, every one of them would be forced to answer that question. The boy who arrived with the new group barely spoke. He kept his eyes down, hands tucked inside sleeves too thin for the cold, like he could hold himself together by force of will. Johann noticed him during evening soup. The boy stared into his tin cup without eating. Steam fogged his lashes. "He's freezing," Johann whispered. "So are we," Eric muttered, but his eyes followed Johann as he crossed the barracks. Johann crouched in front of the boy. "What's your name?" "Lucas." "How old?" 17. Johann breathed out slowly. 17. His brother had been that age when the war started. "Eat," Johann said, sliding his bread across. "You need it." Lucas hesitated. "But eat." He did. That night the first snow fell. It dusted the wire white and turned the camp quiet and unreal. Johann lay awake listening to the wind against the walls and wondered if his mother could see the same snow in Cologne, or if there was even a window left to look through. 2 days later, an argument exploded near the tool shed. A new prisoner lunged after a guard shoved him. Rifles snapped up. Shouts tore across the yard. Johann's heart slammed against his ribs. Then Captain Harris stepped between them. "Enough," he said, not loud, just cert. The rifles lowered. After that, the camp returned to its fragile balance, but everyone felt the crack in it. The war never left. It just waited nearby, testing each choice. That evening, Sarah arrived with scarves and mittens. She handed them out without ceremony. When she reached Lucas, she stopped and draped one carefully around his shoulders. "My brother wore one like this," she said, then caught herself. "Before he shipped out." Lucas nodded, not sure what to say. Later, Johann found Thomas by the fence, staring at the town lights. "You okay?" Johann asked. Thomas shrugged. "Some days this place feels like the only part of the world that still makes sense." Johann understood that more than he expected. A week before Christmas, word came through the camp. The war in Europe was turning, hard, fast. The guards' radios whispered new city names every night. Losses, advances, retreats. The men listened. Johann thought about Thanksgiving, how impossible it felt now, how necessary. One evening, Eric finally said what everyone was thinking. "What happens when this ends?" No one answered. Johann stared at the frost on the window and felt the question settle inside him like snow, quiet, heavy, unavoidable. And the cold deepened as December pressed in. Snow piled against the barracks. Breath hung in the air like smoke. But somehow, inside that frozen quiet, the memory of Thanksgiving kept them warmer than blankets ever could. Johann saw it in small things. A guard slipping extra soup into Lucas's cup. Eric stitching a torn sleeve for a stranger. Sarah bringing paper and pencils so the men could write home before Christmas. One afternoon, Johann sat with Lucas by the stove while the boy wrote his first letter in months. His hand shook as he formed the words. "Tell them you're alive," Johann said. "That's enough." Lucas nodded. At dusk, the camp gathered for roll call. Captain Harris's voice cut clean through the wind. "Men," he said, "I don't know how long you'll be here. None of us do, but I do know this: what happens in this place matters." Johann felt those words settle inside him. That night, Eric spoke from the bunk below. I keep thinking about home. So do I. I don't know who I'll be when I go back. Johann stared at the ceiling. Neither do I, but for the first time in a long while, the thought didn't feel empty. It felt unfinished. On Christmas Eve, Sarah and a few townspeople stood outside the fence and sang. Their voices were thin in the cold but steady. Some prisoners hummed, some cried. Lucas pulled his scarf tighter. I didn't think I'd hear singing again. Johann closed his eyes. Here's the part no one warns you about. War doesn't just take things from you. It tries to decide who you become afterward. And here, in this quiet, impossible place, they were pushing back. As the last note faded, Johann looked toward the wire, toward the dark road beyond it, and felt the future pulling at him, heavy, uncertain, unavoidable. Because soon the world outside would come knocking again, and when it did, every lesson of this strange, merciful winter would be tested. For Johann Müller, the hardest battles of the war didn't happen with a rifle in his hands. They happened later in the quiet when the world finally slowed down enough for memory to speak. By January, the camp was buried in snow, the kind that swallowed sound. Wind slipped through every crack in the walls. Nights stretched on forever. Men dreamed of places that no longer existed. Some woke up calling names that would never answer. Johann kept thinking about Thanksgiving. The table, the turkey. The way Sarah's hands had trembled when she passed the bread. The violin drifting through the cold like something stitched back together. Funny how the mind holds on to the smallest moments when everything else is falling apart. One morning, Captain Harris called Johann and Eric into the office. A small fire burned in the stove, papers stacked neatly on the desk. I need volunteers, Harris said. Work detail in town. The schoolhouse roof got damaged in the storm. Johann nodded right away. Eric hesitated, then followed. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, windows cracked, roof sagging under snow. Children watched from the doorway as the prisoners arrived, curious, cautious, quiet. Sarah was there, wrapped in a thick coat. She smiled when she saw Johann. Thank you for coming. They worked for hours. During a break, Johann noticed her glancing again and again at a photograph in her coat pocket. My brother, she said, missing since Normandy. Johann swallowed. I don't know where mine is either. They sat in silence while snow drifted between them. That afternoon, Johann slipped on the ladder while patching the roof. A memory surged up, a burning house in France, a man screaming in a language Johann didn't understand. He nearly fell. Eric grabbed him. You okay? Johann nodded, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat on his bunk staring at the wall, the past pressing closer than the cold ever could. And here's something war never teaches you how to deal with. Being treated kindly doesn't erase what you've done. Sometimes it makes it louder. The next day, Johann asked Harris for paper. Not to write home, something else. He wrote for hours about fear, obedience, choices that didn't feel like choices until it was too late. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't hide. When he finished, his hands ached. His eyes burned. That evening, he found Thomas by the fence. Why did you treat us that way? On Thanksgiving, Thomas stared at the snow. My brother used to say the war would only end when we decided what kind of world we wanted after it. Johann felt that land inside him. Later that week, the camp gathered, no holiday, no name, just people standing in the cold. Someone played a harmonica. Cards appeared. Laughter flickered. Johann realized something important. He wasn't waiting for the war to end anymore. He was already trying to live after it. But the past isn't done just because you're ready. One gray afternoon, church bells drifted in from town. Johann was repairing a fence when a truck arrived. Officers spoke in low voices. That night, Harris told them the fighting in Europe was getting worse. Cities falling, people running. Eric finally broke. I keep seeing them, the ones we left behind. Me too. They talked until the stove went cold. Days later, Johann began helping Sarah teach the children. One little girl asked if Germany had birds too. Yes, Johann said, just like here. But the weight inside him kept growing. One evening he handed Thomas the pages he'd written. I don't want to carry this alone. Thomas took them. That night, Johann felt something loosen, not peace, not forgiveness, but honesty. And honesty is where healing actually begins. By late February, the snow melted. Radios whispered of armies pushing east, borders breaking, cities becoming wounds. Sarah brought a newspaper, Cologne, what was left of it. "My brother is still missing," she said, "but they say prisoners are coming home." That night Lucas asked, "Do you think there's anything left for us?" "Yes," Johann said, "if we carry something better with us." In early March word came Germany was collapsing. No one cheered, no one cried, they just breathed. At sunset Johann stood at the fence with Thomas. "They say the war might be over by summer. What will you do?" Johann thought of his mother, a kitchen that might not exist. "I'll go home," he said. "And I'll try to be someone worth surviving." Thomas reached through the wire. Johann took his hand, not as enemies, not even as soldiers, just men. And Johann understood something quietly terrifying. The hardest part of war is what happens during it. It's the life that waits afterward. And that life was coming. When the war finally loosened its grip on the world, it didn't do it with fireworks. It did it quietly, like a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. By April, the camp was changing again. Guards spoke more softly. Trucks rolled in with new supplies. Newspapers carried headlines that would have sounded impossible just months earlier. The men read them again and again, like the words might vanish if they looked away. Germany was falling. One morning, Captain Harris gathered everyone in the yard. His face looked older, but his voice didn't waver. "The war in Europe is almost over," he said. "Some of you will be going home soon." No one moved. No one spoke. Johann felt the word home move through him like a shock. It didn't feel solid anymore. It felt like something he had invented just to survive. That afternoon, Johann walked into town with a work crew. The town looked the same, white fences, smoke curling from chimneys, children riding bicycles, but he saw it differently now. Life had kept going while his own world had burned, and that realization landed harder than he expected. Sarah met him by the schoolhouse. "They're talking about transport lists," she said. "Soon." Johann nodded. He didn't trust his voice. They sat on the steps watching children chase each other. One fell, another helped him up. "I'm afraid," Sarah said. "Of what?" "Of what comes after," she said. "Of whether we'll remember what mattered when things go back to normal." Johann thought of Thanksgiving. The long table, the violin, Thomas's brother, the pages he had written. "I don't think we forget things like that," he said. "They change us too much," she smiled, small, careful. A week later, the notice arrived. Germany had surrendered. The camp didn't explode. Some men sank onto bunks. Some stared at walls. Eric laughed once, sharp, broken, then buried his face in his hands. That night the town gathered near the fence. No speeches, no flags, just people standing in the spring air. Sarah brought a small cake. Someone lit a candle. Johann watched the flame and thought about all the nights he had spent in the dark, certain he'd never see another season. The next morning the transport list went up. Johann's name was on it. He folded the paper carefully and sat on his bunk like it might fall apart in his hands. "You're going home," Eric said, slapping his shoulder. Johann nodded. He couldn't speak. Lucas looked up at him. "What's it like to leave?" Johann thought about everything he was carrying. "I don't know," he said, "but I won't be the same man who came here. And here's something nobody tells you: leaving isn't the end of the war. It's the beginning of learning how to live with it." The days before departure moved strangely, too fast, too slow. Johann walked the familiar paths of the camp, touching the walls and fence posts. He wrote one last letter to his mother, careful with every word. Eric packed slowly. Lucas followed Johann everywhere. "I don't want to forget this place," Lucas said. "You won't," Johann told him. "You'll just learn how to carry it." Departure morning came with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Captain Harris shook every man's hand. "Go build something better." Thomas waited by the fence. He and Johann clasped hands without speaking. Sarah stood at the edge of the yard. She pressed a folded photograph into Johann's palm, the Thanksgiving table. "So you remember," she said. "I will." The gates opened. Johann climbed into the truck and looked back at the wire, the towers, the faces that had changed him. The engine started, and the place that had once been his prison became the place where he had learned how to be human again. He didn't know what waited across the ocean, but he knew who he was taking with him, and for now, that was enough. The years passed the way years always do. Not with announcements, but with mornings, with work, with quiet moments that don't feel important until they become your life. Johann Müller returned to what was left of Cologne in the summer of 1945. His street was a skeleton of stone and ash. Windows were empty. Walls leaned like they were tired of standing. His mother was alive, thinner, older, but there in the doorway as if she had been holding that place together by waiting. They didn't speak at first. They just held each other. He never found his father. Johann rebuilt what he could, brick by brick, day by day. He learned the shape of ordinary life again. He worked with his hands. He married. He raised children who only knew the war through the shadows that crossed his face when certain songs came on the radio, or when the nights turned too quiet. And every November, when the air sharpened and the light faded early, he told them about a table in America, about turkey and bread and a violin in the cold, about men who had been taught to hate each other choosing not to, about the moment he learned what mercy actually was. He told them not because it was a good story. He told them because it was the story that taught him how to live. Decades passed. Johann's hair went gray. His hands grew slower. His memories grew louder. One autumn afternoon, he stood in a small town in Kansas with the wind brushing against his coat. His hands trembled as he unfolded a photograph he had carried for more than half his life. The long table, the white cloths, the faces of young men who had once believed the world was nothing but darkness. He had been invited back by Sarah's daughter. Sarah herself had passed years earlier, but her kindness still lived in the town, in the stories people told, in the way they said Johann's name like it belonged there. He walked the old camp grounds. The towers were gone. The wire was gone. Only the wind remained. Johann stood where the table had been and closed his eyes. For a moment he heard the violin again. Now here's something the world doesn't tell you enough. Some moments don't disappear when they're over. They settle into you. They shape every road that comes after. Somewhere else, Eric had grown old too. They wrote letters until their hands could no longer hold the pen. Lucas became a teacher. Thomas named his first son after his brother. And every one of them, in ways large and quiet and lasting, carried that thanksgiving with them for the rest of their lives. Because some moments don't end. They echo. And if this story reached you, if it reminded you that even in the worst chapters of human history, ordinary people can still choose extraordinary kindness, share it with someone who needs that reminder. Because that choice, to be kind when it's hardest, is how wars truly end.